So another example of how this works is India, a place that we don't think of as being very unstable. Mostly it's in the news for its tremendous economic growth. And India is a country where the process of economic liberalization generally gets pretty good press because it's associated with these high growth rates. A lot of the time, the process of economic liberalization, for example, in much of Latin America, has been associated with decades of, or decade and a half of pretty stagnant growth throughout the late 80s and 90s. But whether or not there's robust growth or stagnation, radical free market economics generally also produces increased inequality and increased poverty. And so in India, there is a Maoist insurgency that's been going on since 1969. It started in the district of Darjeeling, named for the tea, or vice versa. And it was for a long time contained in northeast India, in West Bengal, by and large, where it began. But in the last 10 to 15 years, the Naxalites, who are a collection of Maoist parties that unite and split and reunite and are supposedly stamped out and then inevitably come back, they have been spreading down the eastern side of India, down the mountain range called the Ghats, and into the Deccan Plateau in Andhra Pradesh, and that's where I was doing this research. And if you look at maps of their progression down the coast of India, and maps of drought, it goes district by district. Districts where there's very bad drought, a year or so later, generally have Naxalite activity. And what's going on there is the farmers are faced with, again, increasingly extreme climate conditions, a monsoon that can't be counted on. In Andhra Pradesh, where I was, there's just not very much rain. Things are getting drier and drier. The farmers have very little support from the government to fall back on, because the whole kind of mixed economic, semi-socialist model that India pursued after independence began to be rolled back and undone beginning in 1991. And so farmers are increasingly unable to go to state banks for subsidized loans or extra fertilizer or whatever, and they go to moneylenders. And the moneylenders don't really want the land, in part because the land is increasingly worthless because of the environmental crisis. And so they use the crops as collateral, and they demand that the farmers grow cotton. And the farmers are growing genetically modified cotton, which requires lots of capital inputs, lots of pesticides, lots of fertilizers, and they know that it's destroying the soil. But they find themselves in this situation where the only way they can get out of debt, hopefully, is to borrow a little more money to plant another crop, and hopefully that crop will do well and they can pay off their debts. And the reason the moneylenders make them grow cotton is because if they allow them to grow grain, if they use grain as a collateral for the debt, in a crisis the farmers will eat that grain and they'll essentially steal the collateral. So the moneylenders enforce this growing of cotton. The price of cotton goes down and down. The farmers grow more and more of it as the price collapses. They have to borrow more and more, need more and more capital inputs as the soil is degraded more and more, as there's less rain, et cetera, et cetera. And thousands and thousands of farmers across India, caught in situations like this, have committed suicide, very in a horrifically kind of poetic way, by drinking the pesticides frequently that the Bt cotton requires. I'm sure many of you know all about that. But the other thing they do is they commit themselves to committing political homicide by joining the Naxalites. The Naxalites come along and they say, we have an explanation for this. We have an alternative to this. We're going to overthrow the Indian government. We're going to have a socialist society here, and that's certainly better than this misery. And so drought, and the drought corridor is also the red corridor. And the government pushes back with counterinsurgency, which I think exacerbates the situation. I'll get into the problems with counterinsurgency a bit more later, because it involves resettling people. Because counterinsurgency takes as its object the civilian society, it attacks the social bonds of communities. I mean, one classic strategy in counterinsurgency is to relocate people, to wipe out a village, relocate people, re-educate them, to remake, just as revolution tries to remake society, counterinsurgency is counter-revolution, and it too tries to remake the social relations. And very often what it ends up doing is just rending them and not putting them back together in any coherent way. So you get societies marked by anomie, normlessness, and alienation. Plus there's the use of private paramilitary forces in India. In Chhattisgarh they're called the Salvajudum, and they're very much like the Colombian paramilitaries. Right now, at first, they're, the auxiliaries of the government. They're under the control of the government. But who are they? They're basically criminals, working with the government. And they may or may not remain under anyone's control. And in Colombia and parts of Central America, we can see those types of forces don't stop their war when the great ideological questions are over, when the support from foreigners is gone. They continue wandering across the landscape, extorting people, holding up traffic, and they become warlords. Instead of becoming valuable local auxiliaries, they become local warlords. That's the sort of warlordism in Afghanistan to some extent. In Brazil, I began to find some good news. I was looking at if there was a connection to climate change with urban violence in Latin America, because there's a lot of urban violence in Latin America, and Brazil's cities, particularly Rio and São Paulo, has this legendary violence. I mean, I was drawn to it when it was actually in São Paulo, but I went and researched in Rio, where the Mother's Day, I think it was 2006 or 7, the gangs in São Paulo attacked, there was a furlough of prisoners, and they attacked police stations, and there was several days of pitched battles between the police and gangs armed like guerrillas and operating like guerrillas, except they had no demands, there was no revolution, there was no agenda. It was just this highly organized, extremely well-armed, extremely disciplined shadow army attacking the police. And so I went to see if there was any link, and there's a link, but it's attenuated. And what it is that most of the migration to the cities of the south in Brazil has come historically and comes today from the northeast of Brazil, which is a semi-arid region that is getting hammered by climate change. Similar patterns to what's going on in East Africa. Really persistent drought, worse than in the past, punctuated by freak off-season flooding. And the bimodal rainy season controlled by the intertropical convergence zone, which goes a belt of rain that travels with the sun as it travels back and forth between the Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn. That whole weather system is getting out of whack. So people are leaving the land and they're coming to the cities. And when young men show up in these favelas, the slums outside Rio, and they can't find work, there is the option of joining these mega gangs, the main one being the Comando Vermelho, which is, as the name kind of suggests, got its start in the Cold War, in the urban cauldron of a kind of a revolutionary uprising and the state's repression of that revolutionary movement. And so the president of Brazil, Dilma Rousseff, I'm mispronouncing her name probably, but she also comes out of that, actually. She was an urban guerrilla. She was a Marxist guerrilla. She was imprisoned. She was tortured. But she's become, a social democrat. She's still a leftist, but uses very different methods and is still on the scene. Others of her ilk were sent into prison where they tried to organize the prisoners into a kind of revolutionary movement/prison gang that then, which was called the Red Command, which then moved out of the prisons into the communities where they started taxing the drug trade to, accumulate resources for the revolution. And as so often the case, it went the other way around. They didn't control the drug trade. The drug trade contaminated and as like a cancer took over their culture and their ideology. And now the Red Command, which started as a kind of urban guerrilla army, is just an enormous, well-organized narco-mafia. And they do stuff like attack police stations and shoot down police helicopters and have firefights with the cops in these favelas. And so that's not caused by climate change, but part of the reason that there's always more young men ready to do this crazy stuff is because people can't survive on the land. So it seemed to me that, the solution to this violence in urban Brazil lay in the land in part. And so up in northeast Brazil, I found another form of organization that comes out of the same time to some extent, and that was the MST. I mean, I didn't find them. Everybody knows about them. But the landless peasants movement of Brazil, Movimento Sem Terra, has been very effective in the last 20 years or so in redistributing land to the poor by using direct action to occupy unused land and then get title to it. So this one village, there was an MST occupation. There was a road going down this little valley, and on one side of the road, this village owned its own land, and they were using this system of integrated crop management, sort of organic agroforestry mixed crop methodology, which they just called the system, and sometimes called agroecological forestry. And it was really ingenious, and you use like bottles like this with a little hole in the cap, and for like really low impact, cheap drip irrigation just for one plant. And after 5 years of doing this, they managed to restore the soil. Other things they would do is build underground dams. So find places where like there's an arroyo or a wash of sorts where when there is rain or when there's a small spring in this otherwise pretty desiccated terrain, they would, excavate down to the bedrock, maybe 10 feet down, and then build essentially a dam within this ditch that was sealed. So there'd be bedrock and then this dam, and then the soil behind it would maintain moisture. And it's really ingenious stuff they were doing that allowed them to get away from pesticides and fertilizer and have organic food that they could get good money for. And on the other side of the road, the village had been growing, and there was this cattle ranch owned by an Italian absentee landlord, and they decided to occupy some of this land. And at first they were kind of coy about their farming methods over there, but then I was with them long enough to realize, wait a minute, you guys are like, clearing the land, planting monocrops, cutting down trees, using pesticides. What's going on here? And they explained, like, we can't invest 5 years of labor in this plot of land until we know we can own it. The police could come in here at any time and crack our heads. So to survive and make this risk worth it, we have to just make some money each year in this occupation until we win legal title to get this land redistributed from this rich absentee Italian rancher to us farmers. And to my mind, that really illustrated how technological adaptation, this agroecological forestry, organic farming they were using, is really deeply connected to the question of social justice. That you can't expect poor people in the global south to be stewards of the land if they don't have rights to it, and if there isn't redistribution of land and capital and political rights to the most vulnerable people, then they can't operate in a way that restores humanity's relationship to the land and nurtures and rebuilds the land. So, I mean, that's all over the world. There are examples like that, and the problem is they remain, boutique and peripheral, and frequently progressive journalists write about them. We like champion them and kind of blow them up into really more than they are. And the problem is the state hasn't really embraced them yet. And the state is definitely coming back in Brazil. It's like Lula has established the legitimacy of planning, of social democracy, of a mixed economy. I mean, it's not socialism, but it's what it is. It's sort of regulated capitalism with a human face and with a robust role for the government. And unfortunately, the government is not taking this green methodology to the center of their agenda. And that's the kind of change that has to happen to move beyond the kind of happy story boutique marginal example to a real program for change, both social change and ecological change. And Brazil has done a lot under Lula to raise people out of poverty, but that needs to be linked to restoration of the land as well.